All right, everybody. Greetings and good afternoon. We'd want to welcome you to the Ralph Bunch Auditorium. This is the first of African Studies graduate seminars. We are very happy that you've all joined us, both in person and online as well. We are very happy as a cohort to have begun this because we wanted to create a space within the Department of African Studies to nurture and nourish our research ideas. So this is going to be like twice a month. Every 2 weeks we'll be doing this as part of our activities as a cohort. I'll be inviting our chair for this seminar, Dr. Kamara. He's a professor at the Department of African Studies as well as the chair of the department. Very well renowned for his knowledge in history, especially in like West Africa and also beyond. And he's also been our professor, guided us through the politics of Africa when we first got here last year. And we are very grateful to have him be the seminar chair for our very first seminar. So please join us in a round of applause to welcome Dr. Mohamed Kamara.
Thank you, Yao, for that introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who are here in the auditorium and online. First, I must apologize for my voice that doesn't sound natural because it's not natural today. And second, I would like to thank our graduate students for inviting us here. Welcome to this inaugural lecture of the African Studies Graduate Seminar. Our graduate students are establishing this forum for the purpose of sharing their research, obtaining feedback, engaging each other and the faculty in a meaningful scholarly dialogue that will enable them to grow intellectually, enjoy the graduate experience to the fullest, and make a lasting contribution to research and scholarship on and in Africa. This inaugural presentation or lecture is titled The Miracles of Mary Texts, and the presenter is Dawit Muluneh, one of our PhD students. Historically, Africa has been subjected to a Euro-centric narrative that diminishes its contributions to world civilizations and portrays the continent as devoid of any substantial history. In that narrative, Europe is often positioned as the universal incubator and producer of knowledge, of which Africa is a mere consumer. This ahistorical revisionist rhetoric not only jeopardizes the validity of scholarly pursuits, it also negatively influences the formulation of policies. Since the last decade of colonialism, renowned African scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop, Joseph Kizerbo, Théophile Obenga, Ibrahim Babakake, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and many more have steadfastly challenged the Euro-centric falsification of history by researching and presenting core aspects of Africa's undeniable cultural and civilizational wealth and authenticity, and its equally undeniable contribution to the discovery, creation, and dispensation of bona fide universal knowledge. This shift in perspective has laid the foundation for more informed and equitable policies that respect Africa's agency and diversity. It is on that solid platform that our graduate students plan to continue building the edifice of Africa's epistemological respectability in the 21st century and beyond. Ethiopia stands as a counter-narrative to the prevailing Western-centric perspective on Africans and their role in embracing Christianity. Ethiopia's historical trajectory and cultural heritage challenge the narrative that associates the introduction of Christianity in Africa with European colonialism. Among the country's intellectual treasures, the genre of Ethiopic texts known as the Miracles of Mary, TM, has captured the fascination of scholars. These TM manuscripts, which constitute a collection of miraculous stories about the Virgin Mary, have been written over a millennium across the globe. Miracles of Mary texts in Ethiopia drew from early Christian texts and local narratives. Marian texts from the Levant and Egypt influenced the Ethiopian portrayal of Mary, eventually integrating her miracles into the liturgical tradition during the 1400s. Recent scholarly works, particularly the Princeton Ethiopian, Eritrean, Egyptian Miracles of Mary Project, PEMM, have revealed over 1,000 stories, challenging the notion that Ethiopia's Marian texts were merely translations of European works. These stories predominantly predated colonialism and highlight distinctive African perspectives. Today's presenter, Dawit Muluneh, joined Howard University in fall 2023 as a PhD student in the graduate program of African Studies and Research. Prior to coming to Howard University, he received his master's degree at Catholic University in 2020 in Ethiopic and Coptic studies. He completed his undergraduate studies in mechanical engineering at Virginia Tech in 2011. Dawit worked as a patent and trademark in the patent and trademark office as a patent examiner for 3 years. He also learned traditional school and GIES, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, at Debris Libanos Mastery for 1.5 years. Please forgive my mispronunciations and join me in welcoming our presenter, Dawit Muluneh.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm excited to be here. First of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Those of you who've gotten a chance to talk to me know how passionate I am about Ethiopic studies. So there's nothing more pleasant than to come up here and give a talk on this. I'm very humbled. It's an honor to have Dr. Kamara chair this event, and I hope you guys enjoy this lecture on the miracles of Mary. As the title suggests, the topic will be on or the talk is titled The Miracles of Mary Texts. Now, I recognize most people may not be familiar with Ethiopian studies or the Ethiopian and Eritrean church. By the way, I should say, every time I say Ethiopia, insert Eritrea as well, just in case I forget it. They have a common history, particularly for this topic. So I'll be talking about the Miracles of Mary text, obviously, throughout the presentation, but just to give a short synopsis of what these texts are, essentially, they are a collection of stories about Mary. And I'll get into what that means. And of course, when I say Mary, we're talking about the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. But in order for us to have a fuller picture of this presentation, I hope to give pertinent information that will help us understand this talk, beginning with the history of Ethiopia. And I promise to spare you this "We are the great Ethiopia," the Aksumite Empire speech, and I'll just refrain myself to the pertinent part of history that I think will help us understand these texts in a fuller light. I'll get into the literary tradition in Ethiopia and something called the Marian cult. Now, I'm not a fan of this term, but it is a term that is invoked in scholarship to describe the devotion that many people across the world had towards the Virgin Mary. Now, if any of you have ever stepped foot in an Ethiopian Eritrean church, you'll immediately know the presence of Mary right away. That her icons are hanging around the church everywhere you go. People are saying her name. However, we'll see that this devotion to Mary is not exclusive to Ethiopia and Eritrea, but it was there across the regions throughout history. And this is what the Marian cult is referring to. And of course, I'll get to the actual text of the Marian cult or the Marian miracles. So when we begin with the history of Ethiopia and Eritrea, there's two ways to narrate the story. The first is the traditional narrative, the traditional version. This is the version that you'll get if you walk into an Ethiopian church and speak with a priest. And the other is the Western scholarship version, which I'll get into a second. Right now, I want to start off with the tradition. Again, I'm not here to provide all the history and everything in it, but specific areas that I pointed out, and in a Q&A, we can expand on that. But certain traditions that I think are important for the discussion for today. In the traditional sense, Ethiopia is believed to be traced back to biblical times. Specifically, in the book of 1 Kings chapter 10, we find that there's a queen named Sheba who goes to Jerusalem to visit Solomon. Now, the Bible is not clear as to what type of relationship they had when the two met. These ideas and this knowledge comes from an indigenous book known as Jeopardizes that's dated to 1300s that tells us a fuller picture of their meeting. And in this text, the Jeopardizes, it tells us that Sheba is Ethiopian and she visits Solomon and she has a child with him. And the child of the king, Ibn Melech, the son of the king, is corrupted to give the name Minilik. So it's said. And this child of the king of Solomon, the biblical Solomon, is said to have brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia. Ergo, Ethiopians can trace the Judaic history and the presence of Judaism back to biblical times. When it comes to Christianity, traditionalists will point to the book of Acts chapter 8 when it says an Ethiopian man was baptized. And in Islam, Islam is believed to have entered Ethiopia in the 7th century. Again, I'm not ignoring the history. I'm just staying with the relevant part of the history for our conversation today. Now, when it comes to Western scholarship, much of what I said is rejected. And it's not accepted by Western scholarship, nearly everything that I just said. And again, we just don't have the time to break down the reasoning for all of the reasons why they do not accept this traditional view. But I will attempt to summarize the main arguments in this one slide. And by the way, this argument that I wish to present to you here is applied not just for the narrative that I told you, but in even other tradition narratives that exist in Ethiopia. So the argument goes as the following. The Queen of Sheba is said to have visited Solomon somewhere around 1000 BCE. Again, the Bible is not clear as to what kind of relationship they had. That knowledge is derived from a book named colonizers that's dated to about 1300s. So the Western scholar will say, wait a minute, this book that gives us all the knowledge about Solomon and the queen is from a book that's nearly 2,000 apart from the apparent events that occur. Now, if you're listening to this argument, it sounds pretty reasonable. And this logic is used even to explain or rather reject some of the claims made about the Aksumite Empire and some of the characters that the traditionalists say existed during the Aksumite Empire. That's the argument. Now, my pushback and my interest has always been, there's always one thing that's missing from the Western narrative, which is when we're talking about Ethiopian studies, the earliest form of manuscripts we do have are dated from the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. That's to say, when it comes to Ethiopian studies, we just don't have any manuscripts from, let's say, 500 CE or 1000 BCE that is directly related with the events. And instead what we have is the earliest form of the manuscripts that we have do tell the story of what the traditionalists have been saying all along. What does that say about the veracity of the stories? How seriously should we take it? How should we engage with these manuscripts? Remain to be untold. Again, I'm not here to solve all of the problems. I'm just here for us to sit on it so we can ponder on these issues. Moving along. Now, although there are many points where they may not agree, there's obviously issues or parts of history that both the traditionalists and the Western scholar will agree on. Mainly the fact that there was an empire named Aksum that existed somewhere between the 2nd and 7th century. We know this because the first mention of Aksum comes from a trading guide dated to about the mid of the 1st century CE. The northern region of Aksum, known as Adulis, was the center for trade. Now, when you hear trade, don't think in terms of just commerce, but think of exchanging of ideas as well. This is important, especially when we're talking about the dating of when Christianity entered Ethiopia. The Western scholar will maintain that Christianity entered Ethiopia following Rome's conversion. That is the Euro-centric approach. I've argued in several places that if Adulis was the northern region of trade between Europe, India, and other parts of the world, as Christianity was expanding, we would expect them to trade not just goods, but ideas. At least the concept of Christianity must have entered somewhere before Rome's conversion. Staying on the theme of Christianity and the conversion of Ethiopia, one thing is clear. In the 4th century, some form of a conversion did take place. We know this primarily from what we call the Aksumite coins. If you guys see here in the Aksumite coins, the coins dated prior to the 4th century have symbols associated with pagan worship. The coins dated after the 4th century clearly have the cross symbol associated with Christianity. For this reason, the scholars will agree that somewhere in between, around the 4th century, there was some main conversion that took place. And the traditionalists will state that this was the era where Ethiopia became Christianized. But the concept of Christianity, at least Christianity as a religion, may have entered way before that. Moving along to the literary tradition. The first occurrence of writing can be traced to as early as the 1st millennium BCE. That's pretty early. Although it is worth noting that the earliest forms of inscriptions we have are not of Giz, but of South Arabian. The Giz inscriptions can be traced as early as the 2nd century CE, which is remarkable when we think about the narratives put by Westerners saying that Africans didn't have their own form of writing until after colonialism. We're talking 2nd century CE. These are actually inscriptions we see on monuments in Giz. Inscriptions in the early period of Aksum were mainly in monuments, like we see here, and coins, like we talked about before. The inscriptions usually had biblical verses, or they had testimony of expeditions. This was kings championing all the different societies they beat and gloating over other people. Of course, this is what we expect to find. In addition to inscriptions, we see that the written form existed in manuscript form. Now, earlier, you heard me talking about, in terms of Ethiopian studies, the earliest manuscripts we have are dated from 13th, 14th, and 15th century. That is true with one major exception, and that is the Abba-Garima Gospels. The Abba-Garima Gospels, there has been a carbon dating that shows it could go back as early as the 6th century, if not earlier, which means as early as the 6th century, there is production of manuscripts being made. And these manuscripts encompass Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. If we take these writings from the manuscripts along with the epigraphy, we start to begin to develop a pattern in Ethiopian literature, which is, although there are Judaic manuscripts and writings that do exist in Ethiopia, there's Islamic writings and manuscripts, there's philosophical, historical manuscripts that are produced. A vast majority of them are Christian-based. And what we talk about today, which are the miracles of Mary, fall under the umbrella of the Christian texts. So this kind of wraps up the historical part of the presentation. And hopefully with this understanding, you can start to appreciate what the miracles of Mary look like and what they were doing in the society. So like I said, there was a fascination with Mary, not just in Ethiopia, but across the world. I recently learned, actually, that Mary is the most storied person in history. Think about that. That's to say that there is more things written about Mary than Jesus himself. Throughout history, people have been fascinated with Mary. Again, this is not a fascination by just Ethiopians or Eritreans. This was a fascination throughout the world, which is interesting when we read the Bible. And if you're familiar with the Bible, you notice that Mary doesn't have a big role to play in the Bible, in the sense that not a lot of verses are dedicated to Mary in the Bible. Compare that with Paul or Moses, who takes on this big narrative in the Bible. Mary doesn't have these kind of verses. We see that immediately after the 1st and 2nd century, there were writers, Christian writers, who began to develop the theology around Mary. Irenaeus starts to refer to Mary as the second Eve. Now, if you're familiar with Christian theology, you know that Jesus is referred to as the second Adam. So when Irenaeus is calling Eve the second, or Mary the second Eve, he's playing on that, and Mary suddenly begins to have a bigger role. Following that, more and more people begin to be fascinated with Mary, and we begin to see what appear to be biographical tales of Mary, describing her birth, to when she went to the temple, to talking about what she thought, her family, her parents, begin to have dedications and writings about her. And soon afterwards, in the Levant, somewhere around the 5th and 6th century, we begin to see what are known as the Miracles of Mary texts. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. This is not a book we're talking about, but a collection of stories about Mary. And these are mostly, not all of them, mostly about stories after her life. And they're about events, and very beautifully written about events where she comes and she heals some people, she rescues others, sometimes she punishes people. And there are various events that take place within this genre. The story began in Levant and began to expand towards Egypt and came over to Europe around the 1200s, went back to Egypt, and came into Ethiopia in the 1300s. Now, the main takeaway here is it did not originate in Europe. It did not originate in Europe, and this is very important, at least to in Ethiopian studies, because until 2018, the narrative was the miracles of Mary stories that are written in Ethiopian Eritrea are mere translations. So no one even dared to look at them. They were seen as European stories that Ethiopians simply translated. We know that around the 1300s, 8 Marian stories arrived in Ethiopia around the 1300s. In the 1400s, 75 stories were translated into Ge'ez from an Arabic forlaga. That's to say, there were 75 stories that arrived from Egypt, written in Arabic, and translated in the Ge'ez language. In the 1400s, the Emperor Yaaqob integrated the readings of the miracles of Mary into liturgical services. Again, if you're not familiar with Christian tradition, this is a pivotal role by the emperor. As I've mentioned over and over again, these stories are written throughout the world across periods. But what the emperor did was he integrated it with liturgical services. Now, liturgical services are stagnant. They're static. Once you introduce a formula into liturgical service, it sticks. It doesn't change. And you could bet that future generations would keep that formula going because it's something you do over and over and over and over and over again. So when Yaaqob integrated the readings of the miracles of Mary into the liturgical services, this reading, this tradition became cemented in Ethiopian way of life. And sure enough, even to this day, if you go to a liturgical service in Ethiopian Eritrean churches, you will hear the readings of the miracles of Mary. And for this reason, the miracles of Mary was widely received in the regions of Ethiopia and Eritrea. In 2018, Professor Wendy Belcher from Princeton University launched the Princeton Ethiopian Eritrean Egyptian Miracles of Mary Project, or PEM for short, a project that I have been a part of for the past few years. And the team has made some remarkable discoveries. Namely, we've identified over 1,000 Marian stories. Prior to this, there was only 650 known to the Western world. We've identified over 2,500 paintings associated with the miracles of Mary. But perhaps the thing that we're most excited about is that out of the 1,000 Marian stories we discovered, we were only able to identify 64 stories to have European origins. That is to say, only 6.4% of the stories are European. Compare that with 818 stories that are written in African soil. That is to say, over 80% of the Marian stories found in Ethiopia and Eritrea are written in Africa by Africans for Africans. These are indeed African stories. Not all of them were written in Ethiopia. Some of them were written in Egypt. Now, what does that mean? Why should we care about this? As I keep saying over and over, this is not one book we're talking about. This is a collection of stories that has been compiled over a period of time. So in essence, we're saying there are 818 stories written down, most of which were written prior to colonialism. So these stories give us a window to the life, the fabric, the society, the epistemology of African life prior to colonialism. I think it is worth reading these stories and trying to extract the way of life of Africa and what it looked like prior to colonialism. So I've said enough about the Miracles of Mary story, and I would like to introduce you to one story to give you an idea of what these stories look like. And let's do an experiment. What can we learn from these stories? It's a little long, but I hope you will stay with me and also find it as appealing as I do. This particular story is written in Egypt, and it appears in the Miracles of Mary genre around the 1500s. The Miracles of Mary have three parts. The first is known as the introductory formula, and then there's a body, and then there's a conclusion formula. This is the introductory formula. A miracle performed by Our Lady Mary, the twofold Virgin, may her prayers guard us. Amen. A woman lived with her mother-in-law in the region of Cairo. Her house was on the banks of the river, and its waves came up to the walls of the house. This woman saw everything through her window. She loved Our Lady Mary with all her life. This woman had a 7-year-old daughter. She gave her daughter to a nun to teach her the Psalms of David, the books of the prophets, and the testaments of the apostles. The girl completed everything, but after this, she lost her sight. However, it seemed like she could see. Her mother sat weeping, grieving over her daughter, and pleading with Our Lady Mary. One night, while she was sleeping in her bed, she saw in a dream a woman walking in the air above the water. The woman understood that this was Our Lady Mary. She had 2 angels with her. The woman took her daughter and threw her out of the window of her house. She said, "My dear Lady Mary, take this blind girl who you gave to me." One of the angels caught the girl and brought her to the Lady Mary. She stretched out her hand and touched the girl's eyes, healing her at once. That angel brought her back to her mother and said to her, "Take your daughter." At that moment, the woman awoke from her sleep and cried out loudly, "My daughter is healed." Her mother-in-law said to her, "Have you gone mad?" "It is the middle of the night," she replied. "I'm not mad. Rather, my daughter is healed." She awoke her daughter, and the child hugged her. They lit a candle and looked at the daughter. They brought her a silk thread colored red, white, and green. The daughter saw it and discerned the colors. Then they also understood that she was healed. All the people of her house greatly rejoiced. Everyone who had seen this miracle praised Our Lady Mary. That woman lived performing the remembrance of Our Lady Mary all her life. The concluding formula. May the prayers and petitions of Our Lady Mary be with us, with her servant Gabriel Merawi and her maidservant Amina Zeon forever and ever. Amen. What can we learn from this story? It's important to mention that the veracity of the story is not at trial here. For here in African studies, we're not interested to know if there was really a woman who is blind and healed. That's not the concern, at least it shouldn't be, for us in our discussion, in our quest to understand the historical component. Neither, I propose, should we focus our minds on the theological works of this story. Can Mary do miracles? We'll leave that to the theologians. But the question that I'm interested in is it possible to extract the way of life, the fabric that existed in that time when this story was being written? And I think the answer is yes. By the way, I should have mentioned these next 3 points that I'm going to point are not my ideas. We developed it when we were working with the team, so I should probably mention that. I'm not this smart. So the first thing that we could see is there's a non-nuclear family that existed in the 1500s, whether this story is true or not. It tells us that there is a woman living with her mother-in-law and her daughter. And this kind of is reminding us of the African way of life when you invite the aunt, the uncle to live with you and everybody. And it shows the African way of life before colonialism in the 1500s, at least in Egypt. I understand this is one story, but this is the reason why we have 1,000 Marian stories out there. And if we study them, can we begin to see a pattern that exists in the literary to say, look at the fabric, the way of life that existed at that time? Another important point that we can extract from this story is that there's a young girl who's learning how to read. She's being sent to have an education. And I think it's remarkable that that story it's kind of like a sideline. It just says, this woman had a 7-year-old daughter. She gave her daughter to a nun to teach her the Psalms of David, the book of the prophets, and the testament of the apostles. That's the only thing we hear about it. It's not the focal part of the story. And I think that says more about the story, telling us that this was an accepted type of reality, at least at this time. And I think these type of realities can be extracted from the story, at least if we begin to see a pattern in this genre. The last point I think is remarkable. All of the characters in this story are women. There is no men in this story. At least from this story, we can say with assertion that in the 1500s, African stories were being developed that were only women characters. Of course, there were men characters as well, but at least we have one evidence of showing that when Africans wrote history, there were stories that incorporated only women characters. And I think that's a powerful statement to make. And we're getting this without appealing to the divine, without making a theological argument, without looking at the veracity of the story, but by simply looking at the text and what it presents us. As Wendy Belcher always says, what the story doesn't say is perhaps as important as what the story says. So by looking at these stories, not as a spiritual book, but as a story that gives us a window to the society that existed prior to colonialism, I think we have pretty good data here. What I've been interested in is, I don't think it's enough to say these are African stories. That's what the project PEM did. But I think it's important to look further and ask, can we start to notice certain patterns, certain formulas that the African stories have that make them unique when compared against the European stories? In conclusion, the Marian texts is not a singular book, but it's a collection of stories. In this case, we have over 800 stories written, most of them written, before colonialism. And I think that is a great amount of data for us as African historians and students to read and understand what life looked like before foreign corruption. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Dawit, I'm going to stick to your first name because I'm not going to continue butchering your last name. Thank you very much. This was brilliant. Even for a Muslim like me, who is not, even though I began my education in southern France in a Catholic school, but the only thing I remember from there is how disciplinary the nuns are. So till today, when I see a nun, I try to see, am I behaved? But this is brilliant. And I believe that some of the things we are learning here are how our graduate students that we receive here, what kind of wealth, what kind of resources, what kind of potentials they are bringing with them. And when they receive the opportunity to interact, to work with scholars like Dawit did with Princeton scholars, you have a whole volcano, if you will, positively taken, a whole volcano of intellectuality that is just taking a nap somewhere here that awakes and brings out a lot of things that sometimes we wonder, is that my student? Yes, it is your student, as long as you humble yourself to know that your student is also your teacher. We learn from one another. So again, I thank our graduate students for initiating this project. And on your behalf and the behalf of the Department of African Studies, I thank Dawit for this brilliant presentation. So at this particular point, I will beg your pardon to allow me to leave because I'm not feeling well, as I indicated to both of them at the beginning, and let you have the Q&A with Dawit. And I hope that Yao will make these recordings available to not only the Department of African Studies, but the whole university and the world, because it's fantastic. Now, I only have one question, and that question is not mine, but I'm relaying it. Is this part of your dissertation project?
In a way, yes. So I'm starting off with I'm starting where PEM, the project, finished. So I'm trying to see these patterns and what can we really extract from it is the question that I'm asking in my dissertation.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
So yeah, thank you all for being very attentive. At this point, we would open the floor for any questions you may have. Yeah. I'll start. I have two questions. At the beginning of your presentation, it did mention that prior to the coming in of Christianity, there was pagan worship. Do we know like what kind or what form? And my second, if you would allow me, also is, where's my second? I wrote it down. I'll go back and take a look at it.
Sure. So the question is, there was pagan worship in Ethiopia. I mentioned in the presentation. Do we know what kind of pagan worship? So there's a symbol of like the moon and everything in the Aksumite coins, as I showed in the image earlier. I forget the names of these small letter G gods that look like they were worshiping. So, but I wouldn't be able to tell you the details of the names until later. I need to read further on that. But I could get back to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. We also do have some questions on Zoom. But my second question was, have we also looked at the stories, as in those developed in Europe and those developed in Africa? Do we see what are the similarities, points of convergence and divergence in those stories?
So that's the study. That I think I can't state this enough. Barely anyone took the time to read these stories prior to 2018. They were just outside of the Ethiopian Eritrean tradition. But scholars just didn't engage with it. So what Wendy Belcher did is phenomenal by making these stories available. By the way, I should say, there's a website that you guys could go and visit and read these stories. They're made available for everyone, pem.princeton.edu. So this is available for everyone. Now, I will say one of the things that is interesting is even in the 64 stories that I mentioned that are translated from European origin, I've taken the time to look at one or two of them, and although like the central piece of the story are European, by the time they come into Ethiopia, they've developed it and made it their own, which I still think is beautiful. So even the ideas and the main characters are still the same, but there are parts that you're definitely like, okay, that's not in there. That's not in the European version, which I think is pretty cool. But more and more research is needed to say that. And I should mention also that the Miracles of Mary texts have influenced similar texts to be developed in Ethiopia. So you have the miracles of Jesus, the miracles of other saints, patrons. So we could really expand on this research and keep going because there's so many texts like this in Ethiopia. And I think, of course, the Miracles of Mary is by far the greatest in terms of the number of stories. But this project has enabled us to see or to approach research in a different manner that wasn't possible before. Sure.
But if you also have any questions, please feel free. So. Oh, okay. Dr. Lizanza has also raised her hand, and we have. So we take Dr. Lizanza, Dr. Cham, then Amate as well. You can please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawit, for that wonderful presentation. And of course, I'm always excited about girls writing because, as you said, it challenges so many myths that African communities were all oral. And so thank you so much for sharing your research with us. And mine is not a question but a comment. We may want to think of ways of decolonizing some of the terms. Like when you use the term pagan, I hope is not referring to African indigenous religion. Because if we do that, it's not correct. So we have to think of ways of how do we term especially African ways of life. We have to rethink. We can't afford to follow the footprints of the colonizers that all sorts of African worship was pagan worship. So I just want you to think about that. If that paganism was referring to African traditional religion, you want to rethink about that. So again, thank you so much.
I'll say this, Dr. Lasanza, thank you for that comment. I came over from Catholic University, and a lot of the articles that I'm reading are definitely Western-based. So I'm still working on decolonizing a lot of the stuff that I read. So thank you for that comment, because that is correct. In African studies, we don't. But if you read any literature on this topic from Ethiopic studies scholars, which are often Western, it is pagan. That is the term they use. It is wrong, and I agree, and that is something that I need to correct. So thank you for that comment.
Yes, and that's why it's so important that you are doing. You are part of that project, so that you correct those mistakes. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Cham, then Amate, then we'll come back to our fiscal audience as well.
Okay, let me echo my colleagues here to say what a wonderful presentation, Dawit, not just in relation to the sort of information that you're sharing, but also in relation to some of the things that we can really take away and learn from, the specific approaches that you and your team are taking in engaging these historical canonical texts here. Specifically, I think what resonated with me very, very strongly is the points that you emphasize in your concluding statements, that in looking at these texts, it's not the veracity, the literalness of the text that should be the focus of our attention, but really looking at what we can extract from these texts for what it tells us, the kinds of things that it conveys about the various aspects of the societies and the structures of thinking, the structures of acting, and the logics and epistemologies of these societies out of which it came. So I think that is something that should be retained as really very, very valuable in whatever you guys are doing in relation to engaging these texts here. That you don't focus on the miracles, okay? The miracles are important, but the miracles, just like when you look at other texts in other African oral traditions, for example, and written traditions, there are these magical elements, is fantastic, these elements of fantasy, and so on and so forth. And we should not take them literally. They are metaphors. They are ways of talking about all the things. And I think, what your presentation and your work is doing is really calling attention, focusing our attention to these other important things that we can get from this text, and not really just focus on the text for the sake of focusing on them, and which would lead to just dismissing them as being just simple fantasies and so on and so forth. So that is something that resonated very, very strongly with me, and I think it's a very, very strong point in your work that I would encourage you very strongly to emphasize and develop, and really focus on. Okay? So congratulations, Dawit.
Thank you.
Really, very, very, I enjoyed the presentation very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'll definitely say that I've seen that this question of the veracity of the stories adds what I'll call unnecessary pressure to have a meaningful dialogue. And for the non-Ethiopian or the non-Eritrean, they're afraid to offend the tradition. They don't want to say something that will offend how people will accept it. And for the Ethiopian and the Eritrean, they feel compelled to kind of defend the stories. Now, if you take the veracity of the question out of it, then you're able to have a meaningful conversation without offending anyone, and just approaching the text as texts and really doing some due diligence. And I think perhaps for this reason, these texts haven't been critically examined, engaged in a meaningful way, especially in a place like African studies. I mean, these are data points that we're looking at, significant data points that will enable us. And again, these are not just Ethiopian and Eritrean stories. They were written in Egypt as well. So we can think of them not just home to Ethiopia, but I think as African stories. And I think that is pretty remarkable.
And I think also, to just add to what you're saying, since this is part of your future dissertation project, to also maybe go beyond simply just, in addition to the important element of extracting information out of it, but also to talk about the, I don't want to say style, but these elements that are really reflective of the indigenous Ethiopian, Eritrean aesthetics and ways of communicating, of telling stories, And I think you have in the Ethiopian tradition this, particularly in the church, this notion of the triptych, which I think you do invoke in terms of, the particular story that you shared with us. I think the structure pretty much sort of reminds us of that kind of formal, element within, the narrative traditions coming out of that part of the continent there. So I think, it would be another really great contribution, an important part of your project to look at, and develop as you engage further in this line of research there. So
Thank you so much.
okay.
Thank you.
So Amate, please hold up. We'll come to Prof. PT. Amate, give us a minute, please. We'll come to you, please. And sorry, because all the other speakers, we kind of know ourselves. But please, for all of us moving on, please introduce yourself so that we may know and we go on with your question. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Okay. My name is Baicham. I'm a professor in the Department of African Studies here at Howard.
Mario Beatty. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Afro-American Studies.
Okay.
It's phenomenal presentation.
Thank you.
As I thought about this presentation and the question of veracity, Dawit, I'm thinking of a much more foundational issue, and that is how do we define and operationalize what conversion is in and of itself? Like, what does that concept actually mean? And the thing that I want to kind of submit is the work being done in terms of Egypt, which I'm very familiar with this side in terms of antiquity, but the work by David Frankfurter in terms of the Christianization of Egypt, his work on the religion in Roman Egypt, these works are coming to reorient what conversion meant on the Egyptian side. So it isn't the case, Frankfurter makes the case that it isn't the case that Egyptians are converting to Christianity, is as much it is the case that Christianity is being converted to the power of these pre-existing spiritual systems and cosmologies. They're being converted to these pre-existing cultures. And when you look at all of the narratives, the stories that are happening, that have been well soiled and well watered in the Nile Valley, in Egypt in particular, in terms of the stories of a goddess named Isis, who, this is well known in terms of Coptic Christianity, this is well known in terms of E.R. Witt's work, in terms of Isis in the ancient world, but it's well known that the forerunner to Mary is the goddess Isis. That's what makes this make sense, is that there is a pre-existing cosmology and goddess in the Nile, or goddess concept in the Nile, that made this conversion possible, meaning that Christianity at its origins did not elevate Mary. The reason why it doesn't have a prominent presence in the Bible is because it's not prominent in the culture. And what you see in Egypt is that this principle is prominent in the culture. And that's why it was indispensable. They could not, quote unquote, convert anyone to this kind of new frame without speaking to this more ancient frame. So when I look at the story that you show in terms of the Mary text, what I'm seeing is an ancient story. I'm seeing Isis on the Nile in these dynamic, different ways, different forms, and they're repeating the dynamism of linking and looking at and feeling the presence of this goddess principle in a new vessel. And I guess my question is that even in terms of Ethiopia, is that the same thing that we're seeing? You know, it's that once we get out of the frame of trying to defend the veracity of Christianity, of the faith, once you get out of that frame and look what comes before and look what's on the ground, look what's in the society, look what's in the pre-existing cultures and cosmology, then it makes sense. You know, once you remove it from the question of quote-unquote veracity within the confines of the standards that they create to narrate what it means to be a quote-unquote Mary text. So all I'm saying is that we need to open up the cultural and cosmological playbook and to give more credence actually to a quote-unquote pagan, but we need to give more credence to the cultures that actually soil these ideas, which it probably should be attributed to those pre-existing cultures and not so much to Christianity. It's not that Christianity is giving it, it's that it's already there. and Christianity becomes the new vessel to express it.
Very good points. I'll say I'm not at all an expert in Egyptian history and culture.
I am.
I'll take you at your word. There's interesting conversations about what conversion really means. And if we even push back into what Christianity is, there's interesting conversations about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, for example, and Christianity. Some theories are, there are different forms of Christianity. Which form did one is, so there.
Read Bart Ehrman's work, it's there. It's lost Christianities. It's like it's not one thing.
Right. So there's several questions that I think we can ask, but I think in Ethiopia, what we ask about Christianity has to be remembered that this is the traditional view that Christianity entered Ethiopia. And this is not some external force that's saying this, but it is an internal concept and tradition that was within it. So I think that, and more research is needed, when we do talk about Ethiopian Christianity and Ethiopian Judaism, we should treat it differently than we do, let's say, Egypt or the rest of Africa for that reason. And when I'm speaking of veracity, I think I need to be very clear here. When it comes to the Marian text, I'm talking about the veracity of the characters and the miracles that take place. When we're studying these texts, we focusing on these questions, I think, take away from what we can really learn from the text. As far as going back to conversion and all these things, even in the Ethiopian tradition, as my understanding is, the idea is that the Christian man stated in the book of Acts chapter 8 accepted Christianity as not so much as converted, but accepted. That is an ongoing event from the Judaic to Christianity. This conversion idea is a Western narrative, but these are interesting questions. I think we should explore at least, and it is every historian from different disciplines is going to come and look at these texts differently.
Because the miracles of Isis are
Exactly.
legendary across the Mediterranean, across the whole range and rim of the Mediterranean.
Right.
It's obvious to me what's the ground in which this is being sold.
Right. So again, I will say that these texts are written everywhere, and what would be interesting, I think I'll say, is to study the stories written in Egypt and see what kind of pattern we can develop in Egypt and see how they conform or divert from some of the narratives that we were talking about, and then comparing it with the Ethiopian stories that are written in Ethiopia and comparing these. And that is the type of, I think, direction that I'm trying to go. Are they different? Are they similar? We don't even know these things because we haven't looked at these texts in detail. But they open very engaging conversations, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I just think that we need to have a frame that allows us to be more flexible in terms of embracing and narrating the power of what comes before
Yes.
Christianity.
Yes. 100%, yes.
As not just informative, not just peripheral, and not just additive, but substantive and core and foundation.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that. Yes.
Sorry,
Oh,
we had one online. Amate, if you'd want to, introduce yourself.
No. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Amate Lalaye. I'm a first year PhD student at the Department of African Studies. It was a very good presentation, and I think there's so much that I've really gotten to know. But Dawit, respectfully, I normally use this word. So, two things. I know this is a part of your dissertation, but I really want to find out if you have a working thesis for what you are doing for what you've done so far, and also what methodologies are you using for the work. So two things, working thesis and then the methodology you are using for the work. Thank you.
Yes, So how I'm going about this story is, like I said, there's 1,000 stories out there. So I'm reading through the stories and trying to identify certain common trends, common themes when it comes to the characters, when it comes to the miracles that are taking place, and trying to look at differences. And one preliminary thing that I've seen is that, for example, when it comes to the Ethiopian stories, most of the miracles appear to be focusing on church-related events. That is, the priest will come and the church is locked, and he petitions Mary, and the door is suddenly open. It's things related with events surrounding services, and from that we can extract and conclude, this is what the people of Ethiopia were focused on, and this is how the miracles of Mary tells us, right? This is where their attention was. Compare that with some of the European stories that appear to be usually around lust. There's a nun who sees a guy and she fornicates, or something to that effect. Is this enough to say absolutely we see differences between different traditions? No, but I do think it's an indication to say, at least for the miracles of Mary, we're beginning to see a pattern that tells us something. Now, when you add on the other texts that also exist in Ethiopia, you could start to make more definitive claims about the society and what you see there. Did I answer your question?
Okay. But I was really thinking, because you're talking about decolonizing and then dealing with issues of decolonization, you may have an anti-decolonial maybe framework or something that you're using as a lens in, going about the work life. But I think I got what you also said. Yeah, since it's a work in progress, maybe as you continue, there are more things you share with us in the near future.
Right. To be clear, that part of the presentation is to say that we have texts that exist prior to colonialism. So this is not a work to expand the work of Ngugi, for example, to decolonize the mind or literature study, but it is a way to say, look, these texts existed prior to any corruption of foreign influence. So what can we say about these societies that existed at the time, compared with the European model? I think that might be clear.
Yes, I think I can now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So we'll take like how many more? Okay, so we'll take 3 more to close to it, since we end at 4:30. So 1, 2, then 3. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Pitson. I work with the United Nations, and also I have a strong affiliation with another global network called Knowledge Management for Development. And I have a very strong interest on the video publication, first and foremost as a proud Ethiopian. This is a very affordable.
Thank you.
Thank you. And second of all, as a person who has collaborated with
Oh, wow.
Because it has a very good depth, and I'm more than happy to connect to it or with my little knowledge. I'm more than happy to see all the possibilities and all the resources.
Well, thank you for the offer. Absolutely. Who turned down something like that? So, absolutely, thank you so much. It's very humbling, and hopefully we could talk afterwards. But definitely, yeah.
Okay, hi Dawit. Like everyone has said, this has been wonderful. I didn't know what to expect, so it didn't feel like research. It was very interesting, and I'm not sure I really have a question. I think that just speaking for most of us who are audience scholars and who are unsure of about how to go about research, you just opened my eyes because I didn't see where you were going. And as soon as you said it's not about the veracity of this, I was like, yes, okay, so I see it now. So for me, I've learned that as a scholar and someone who's going to do a lot of research, there are so many other um, avenues to find your data sets to support whatever your research question is, or whatever it is you're trying to find out. I think for me that's the biggest lesson I have learned from here, because I didn't see where you were going, but it's very strong, the information you just put out.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
My name is Lamma. Due to traffic, I was on Zoom. Mine is not question, but a comment and suggestion. First of all, the belief of Ethiopian system. Before Christianity, no pagan worship in the official in the country. Ethiopian belief system is in 3 stages. The first stage is God's moral law, conscious laws, from Adam to Moses. Ethiopia worship through that law in one God. The second one is Judaism. Judaism also practiced in Ethiopia. For example, the Ark of the Covenant is preserved in Ethiopia. For centuries, Isaiah and Abraham, Asma, they worshipped in one God, but the European story, they depicted them as a pagan worshipper. No. Based on the Ethiopian history, church history, official history, no paganism exercised as official religion in the Ethiopian entire history. Christianity, after Jesus' resurrection, Ethiopia accepted Christianity. So Judaism to Christianity. For example, the Queen of Sheba, she was worshipped in one God. She went to Jerusalem to visit Solomon because of his faith. God gave him. So that's my little comment about the belief system of Ethiopian Christianity. Dawit, most of your, when I heard your presentation, most of your presentation is based on the European scholars. So another suggestion for your work, for this dissertation, for example, you can see in the miracle of Mary how the Ethiopian marginalized because of their blackness by the Egyptian. It's recorded in the book. Also, Holy Virgin Mary, she marginalized because of her lifestyle in the Judaism society. So it's more based on like the Howard discipline. You can show us more how Ethiopian marginalized because of their color, face color in Jerusalem, in Egypt monastery. So it's a lot of miracles over there. So the main thing is the Ethiopian belief system based on the Ethiopian teaching, history, church history, no paganism exercised in the Ethiopian tradition. Even the Isis one, the Egyptian practice, first introduced by the Ethiopian, but lately it's diverted to, like a paganism. So that's all. my suggestion, because the Ark of the Covenant is preserved in Ethiopia. Moses' wife, she was from Ethiopia. Abraham blessed by the Ethiopian man, Melchizedek, and Moses instructed by the Ethiopian priest, Jethro. So we have a lot of, history. For example, at the time of Jeremiah, Abimelech, the Ethiopian Abimelech, he was the advisor of the court. So this kind of history shows us Ethiopia believed in one God. So no paganism, but that thought is from the European notion, the European concept. So we decolonized knowledge means we decolonized the European concept, notion. So that's my suggestion. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So, as you correctly stated, in the tradition, there's several claims we make about Ethiopian history, and the presentation was focused on showing the tradition-based and the Western European-based. So the Western European tale says, here's the data points, here's the things that they explain, and here are the conversion points, whatever conversion means. And here's the Ethiopian narrative that we stick with, and here's the narrative that is told here. Now, it's up to us to figure out and to investigate which tradition to accept based on the methodology that we pick. When it comes to the stories of the miracles of Mary, the veracity of the story, whether or not these miracles are taking place, are less of a concern for us. Not to say that the stories are not true or false, but these are not the questions that are at stake. For example, as you correctly stated, there's an interesting story for my personal research that has been important. One Ethiopian going and worshiping with other fellow Christians, and the Egyptians looking at him and pushing him out from the circle. Again, the veracity of the story not being questioned. Why is this text there? What does this tell us about the mind frame that's written? Why did they write these stories? And what does that tell us about the relationship of the stories? These are the points, I think, to take into place. Again, I can't emphasize, if we focus on the veracity of the stories, we are missing an opportunity to study and engage with these texts. There is a traditional form that exists that people very proudly adhere to, and there is the Western narrative that will point to data points and say, hey, here's the narrative. Our position is to look at these stories and figure out which methodology that we could look into, tap into the African indigenous way of life, and try to figure out where that stands. And more importantly, that I can't emphasize this enough, if we are afraid to engage with these texts, they remain on the shelf for centuries and centuries on, without really learning what we can capture from these perspectives. So thank you for that comment, and absolutely, this is why I always say there's two ways to narrate the story. This is how I began with the presentation. There's the indigenous way, and then there's the Western narrative way. And our job as African students is to look at these two and figure out, with all the resources that we've received from African studies, which data points we can use to tell the narrative from the perspective of Africa. And that is, I think, the takeaway of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Dawit.
Thank you so much.
For agreeing to do this. You've definitely set the bar really high for the rest of us graduate students. We also want to acknowledge the director for graduate students at the Department of African Studies, Dr. Clark. Thank you for also gracing us with your presence. So once again, this is going to go on like every 2 weeks, and the next, I would actually be presenting in the next 2 weeks, April 4th, on Jinyame and African Cosmological Thought. So we do welcome all of you, to once again come and be present with us. Thank you all, and have a good day.